Thank you so much, Marion, and thank you to all of you for being here. I feel like I'm lucky enough to have just joined U.S. News & World Report to start up an Ideas and Opinions section, and I feel like I drew the lucky lottery number here because, of course, all panels are great. The whole day has been great, but I feel like I got the best panel. So you are in for a serious, serious treat. We are going to be talking about something that is literally dominating the headlines. It's what you see in our pages. It's what you see on the news. It's a key question as we as Americans all grapple with what is going to happen with our democracy this year in 2024 as we approach these incredibly momentous elections. And we could not have four better experts arrayed here on the stage in front of you to really take you through this, to understand the mechanics of what our votes mean, and specifically how in November this is all going to play out, at least from a legal standpoint and the point of view of voter access. So I just thank you all so much for being here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I want to start with you, Secretary Griswold. I know that as the Secretary of State in a really important swing state, you really sort of sit in a hot seat that is just going to get hotter and hotter as the days go forward about how you count votes, who gets to vote, who maybe doesn't get to vote. So I want to ask you, I feel like misinformation and disinformation certainly played a huge role in the 2016 campaign and has been playing a role ever since in elections. Tell us about what your state has done to adapt to a climate of fear and misunderstanding and misapprehension about what voting laws really are. Tell us how you're working through that in your state.
Well, first off, thank you for having me. I really appreciate U.S. News and everybody coming out. So we're going to start off with the little topic of misinformation and its effect on democracy. I'm happy to report that Colorado is tied for number one with the highest confidence in the nation in our elections. But with that said, we have been under an onslaught of misinformation, disinformation from our foreign adversaries, but also from domestic actors that has really intensified since 2020. We are at the forefront of combating it. For example, I opened up the first state-level counter-disinformation office in 2019. And since then, we've been running public awareness initiatives, paid initiatives to Coloradans, alerting them of the role of disinformation and that they need to go to a trusted source. And I know that sounds, that's too easy. But what we learned from our allies in Eastern Europe who were subject to Russian foreign disinformation before us is that the number one tool is a prepared citizenry. So that has been really effective. We've also cracked down on the effects of disinformation quite sternly. So make no mistake, disinformation is a political tool. It is being used by our foreign adversaries. It is being used by Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans to try to undermine our institutions. And it leads to actual effects. It has been the justification for hundreds of voter suppression bills introduced across the country. We have stopped every single voter suppression bill introduced in the state of Colorado. It has been used as the justification to incite security breaches on our elections. I actually addressed the nation's first public insider threat when a county clerk in 2021, so the elected official in the county who administers the election, compromised her own system trying to prove the big lie. So went in, decertified all the voting equipment, put my actual 2018 Republican opponent in charge of the county, but then I led the nation's first law on insider threats, making that type of behavior a felony. But on top of that, we see the effect of disinformation lead to the threat environment that's really disabling towards election workers. We might touch base on the big case I was involved in, the Trump disqualification case that went to the United States Supreme Court. That was filed in September. It was resolved on March 4th of this year. And in that time frame, I alone received nearly 900 death threats or violent threats. That's happening all across the country. And we've been reacting as quickly as possible in Colorado, but folks are stepping down, and we need states really to lean in to criminalize this type of behavior, prosecutors to prosecute, the DOJ to really lean in. And those are the effects of disinformation. So, we are doing absolutely everything we can, and I think we have been doing the most in the country, but we are seeing the effects every single day of this disinformation atmosphere in destabilizing American democracy in our elections.
Quick follow-up, because you brought up the case with former President Trump, and I ask because the word voter suppression means different things to different people. It's very politicized. So progressives might think that voter suppression means, rollback of the Voting Rights Act. Conservatives may say, oh, it means gerrymandering in favor of minorities, or there's been criticism of the Colorado Supreme Court's effort to keep Donald Trump off the ballot, and there are those who say, well, you're disenfranchising, not you personally, but that the Supreme Court of Colorado was disenfranchising those voters who wanted to decide for themselves at the ballot box. So what do you say to critics who would say that's voter suppression of its own form?
Well, so this case was a big old case. The question was, did Donald Trump's role in inciting the January 6th insurrection bar him under the United States Constitution for appearing on the ballot in Colorado? 6 voters, Republicans and unaffiliated, actually filed the lawsuit alleging that they would be disenfranchised if an unqualified, disqualified candidate was on our ballot. I was a defendant in the case. It made its way to the Colorado Supreme Court. That determined Trump is an oath-breaking insurrectionist, and under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, he was barred. It went up to the United States Supreme Court. To be very clear, the United States Supreme Court did not say that Trump did not engage in insurrection. They did not say he would be disqualified or not be disqualified. What they said is Congress has to act first, that a state cannot bar a federal candidate before Congress takes some type of action. And I would say the Trump camp said quite a lot during that lawsuit. And I think, at the end of the day, it is not suppressive to execute the mandates under the United States Constitution. Candidates are qualified all the time. There are qualifications to run for president. There's qualifications to run for state office. And at the end of the day, the Colorado Supreme Court did what it believed was the constitutional thing to do. And the United States Supreme Court put a caveat in how we understood that. As Secretary of State, I will tell you, I do believe Trump engaged in insurrection, and I do believe that the Colorado Supreme Court got it right. And when we went to the United States Supreme Court, I took the position, that it is up to the state to qualify or disqualify someone under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment for engagement in insurrection. But through the entire case, I said, look, as Secretary of State, I, of course, am going to follow what the court says. I'm going to follow what the trial court says. I'm going to follow what the Colorado Supreme Court says and the United States Supreme Court says. And I think that's a big fundamental difference between what we're seeing in this country. We can disagree on how a law is executed. We can disagree on how the United States Constitution is interpreted. But we should all agree that there is a final say. And we're seeing from the Trump hush money case that some people no longer believe that in this country. And that is putting the rule of law in peril. And, I know you're asking a bigger question. Well, some people say, have different interpretations for the same terms. But I think it's really important as a country, and especially when talking with the news, to really remember there are not two sides to the truth. There are not two sides to the truth. There was either someone who tried to steal the 2020 election or there was not. But we cannot allow the rewriting of American history to fit a political narrative for folks trying to destabilize institutions. And of course, there's nuance, and it's up to all of us to work through that, but we cannot allow people to redefine terms on their own basis that are not based in facts.
Well, I'm going to ask you to remember all of that and write it down for me, and I'll publish it as an op-ed. You see, you're doing my work for me here. Excellent. All right, Neil, you were obviously Solicitor General of the United States, and voting rights cases were very much part of your purview, and part of what you were trying to defend was voting rights. So take us through briefly what you think have been the most significant voting rights decisions from the Supreme Court in recent years, and are there certain trends that either concern you or that reassure you with regard to voting rights?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I've had the privilege of working with both Jenna and Mary before, and they're exquisite, and so it's awesome to be with you. And LaFleur, I know your work, and it's really a privilege to be with you as well. So just by the way, on this question about did Jenna's litigation disenfranchise Colorado's voters by the Colorado Supreme Court decision, I think the answer to that's really easy. No, I mean, the Constitution says you can't be an insurrectionist. It's no different than, like, I'd like to vote for Jennifer Granholm for president, or maybe even Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I can't because the Constitution says you have to be a natural-born citizen. I might want to vote for someone under 35 who's really good, but I can't because the Constitution forbids that. And another bedrock thing in the Constitution is you can't be an insurrectionist. So I don't think the case, unfortunately, was argued well, but I think Jenna was 100% right in the argument that she made to the court. For your question about voting rights and how things have changed, I think this panel is about the right to vote, and I think things have changed so dramatically. When I first joined the Solicitor General's office in 2009, Barack Obama had just won. The nation had elected its first African-American president, and I was tasked with trying to defend the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act 2 months later in the Supreme Court in the Northwest Austin case. And there were many people who thought, well, now that we have an African-American president, the need for the Voting Rights Act, this canonical piece of legislation from 1965 that literally has the blood of patriots on it from the bridge and things like that we don't need that anymore. And we mounted the defense in the Supreme Court saying voter suppression is real, there's discrimination against minorities, that the mechanism that was in the statute in 1965, which required pre-clearance before certain jurisdictions would change their rules because they were so crafty, they'd move a poll place the day before an election, or they'd change the voting rules on districting or on balloting or all sorts of things. There were so many different possible things they could do to suppress the vote that in 1965 they said, you're not allowed to make any changes without pre-clearance from a court or from the Justice Department. That's what was being challenged. And by the way, that statute, that Voting Rights Act, that provision had just been reenacted by Congress a couple years before. The vote 421-3 in the House of Representatives to re-up the Voting Rights Act and that provision, and in the Senate 98-0. When I argued the case in the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia asked my co-counsel, who went after me, he said, look, counsel, this was passed 98-0. Nothing passes 98-0. It must be symbolic. And I was sitting there like, this is when I wish I was at the podium, but I'd already spoken, because I would have said, Justice Scalia, your confirmation vote was 98-0. But that was the consensus at the time politically and in the Supreme Court. 8-1 decision written by the Chief Justice to affirm the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. And then things changed darkly 4 years later in the Shelby County decision. The very same provision that they had upheld just 4 years before, they struck down and said was unconstitutional. That's a huge game change when it comes to voting suppression and discrimination now. And it's enabled and fueled attempts in states and jurisdictions to take away your right to vote. So, that to me, Shelby County is the most significant case. It's the case that Justice Ginsburg's probably best dissent in that case. She has this line saying, throwing out the Voting Rights Act because you think discrimination is done is kind of like throwing out your umbrella because you think, that you're not getting wet. The point is, you will at some point. You need it prophylactically. I am concerned about the direction of the court when it comes to voting rights generally. Maybe not as concerned as some of the people on the left who think that it's always the court trying to suppress the vote and to hand elections to Republicans. I argued a case last year called Moore versus Harper. That, if you think back to the 2020 election and those 62 times that Donald Trump had tried to bring lawsuits, and they all failed, and many of them failed in state court. And so the Republican National Committee devised this constitutional theory that said state courts have no business in federal elections, zero. It's only up to state legislatures. This was an opportunistic theory for them because the Republican Party is invested in state legislatures and not in state courts. And so when the case was granted and I was asked to argue it, I think everyone on the political left thought it was an absolute loser. This Supreme Court is going to hand this case to Republicans, and if they did so, it would entrench Republican rule for decades. It was that significant in the stakes. I looked at it and thought, this is a case about checks and balances, the original understanding of the Constitution. It's all in our favor. We're going to win. And lo and behold, we did win the case 6-3 in the Supreme Court. So when you hear these, doomsdayer scenarios, the court's always going to side with the Republicans or always going to side with Trump, I don't think that's quite right.
All right. Mary, as the president of the American Bar Association, you have sort of made this a mission of yours, voting fairness. Let's just take out any politicization of terms, and you've created task forces specifically about this. Tell me a little bit about the disconnect between new voting rights laws and the public's perception of them, and tell us what the ABA is doing to try to address threats to democracy, especially in swing states, and ensure fair voting in swing states.
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me here. It's wonderful to be on this panel. When I was thinking about my term as president of the American Bar Association, I was thinking, what can I focus on that will be meaningful? And I kept coming back to what I think is not just the most important legal issue, but the most important issue in our country, which is threats to democracy. And the statistics are very sobering. Like, less than 1/3 of millennials think it's essential to live in a democracy. I think over 20% of people think that a resort to violence would be acceptable if their candidate didn't win. And so even though there's been a lot of, I think, there's been a mixed bag in terms of voting rights laws in different states. We've seen some of the more Republican-controlled legislature states like Georgia and North Carolina kind of rolling back access to voting. On the other hand, we've seen Michigan and Nevada kind of open up things like more early voting, prepaid postage on early voting. And so even though I think the statistics say people are waiting less in time for voting, there's a perception out there that it's harder to vote now. And one of the things we did, we created the Task Force for American Democracy, and we purposely are not focusing on the voting rights laws per se, because unfortunately, I think everything is political now. We're trying to focus on the integrity of the systems, which the Secretary does every day. And so we have a task force. It's co-chaired by former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson and former federal judge J. Michael Luttig, and you all may remember him from the January 6th hearings. He is the person that the vice president turned to ask, can I overturn this election? And Judge Luttig told him, no, you cannot. So we've been doing a number of things. The purposes are to instill trust in our election systems, to increase the knowledge of civics into our culture, and then to propose any improvements. And one of the things we've been doing is, because we've all seen there's going to be about 6 states that decide the election this year where voting was contested a lot, the 62 cases that Neil referenced. And we've been doing listening tours. So we've done one in Georgia so far, one in Michigan, Pennsylvania, the next one's in Wisconsin. And we've been thrilled to have the secretaries of state in all those states involved, talking with local election officials, state election officials, and then more importantly, setting up next step committees in those jurisdictions to lead up up to the election, but more importantly, beyond the election, because we saw in 2020 the time where all the threats are coming, all the challenges to the election is after the election occurs. So they're setting up rapid response teams, speakers bureaus, civics, and working on that. So those are some of the things we're doing.
Okay, great. LaFleur, you are probably the one person on the panel who has the luxury, if we can call it that, of actually taking a step back and studying this and analyzing the data and having a more historical view of all of the trends together. So educate us. We all hear about the racial turnout gap. Tell us what your analysis shows the history is of that over time, and explain to us what factors contribute to low turnout among voters of color.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks again for the invitation. So, yeah, unlike my fellow panelists, I'm coming at this from a political science background. I'm not an attorney, but I do analyze data and bring data to bear on these important questions. And so I should say this is not necessarily my analysis, but I am reporting on some of the public opinion data available and other analyses conducted by political scientists. So first off, in terms of thinking about what is the racial turnout gap, and that's a term that refers to the difference in turnout in any given election between white voters and their counterparts of color. And this has historically and contemporarily been a notable gap. So recent research, for example, shows that in the last 3 elections, so 2018 through 2022, the eligible percentage of whites who turned out to vote was about 43% across those 3 elections. Now that number is maybe a bit misleading because we're talking about 2 midterms within there where turnout tends to be a bit lower. But even given that, we see that only about 43% of white Americans turned out in those last 3 elections, and that's even further lower for their minority counterparts. So we see roughly about 27% of African Americans who were eligible to turning out during that time. And so roughly a gap of 16 percentage points between white Americans and their African American counterparts. And when we look at Asian Americans and Latinos, those numbers decrease even further. And so this is really troubling in terms of the implications for our democracy. One, we see that the majority group is not even turning out in majority numbers. That is to say, less than 50% of eligible white Americans even turned out in those 3 elections. But even more so, it's even worse for their minority counterparts, and we also see this gap increasing post-Shelby. So as Neil talked about the deleterious effects of Shelby, we see the racial turnout gap growing post-2013. And the ways in which we think that this gap has increased is largely due to many of the actions that have been taken post-Shelby. So things like purging voter rolls, having stricter voter ID laws, requiring photo identification, all of these factors have had a compounded effect. And the research also indicates that these actions have increased in places that were covered by that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So relative to places that were not covered, we see an increase in many of these laws that are increasing that turnout gap across races.
Secretary Griswold, I want to ask you, you were right there on the front lines of some of these threats to voting rights that we're talking about. So both from the point of view of the impact of Supreme Court decisions that have rolled back voting rights, but also in terms of actual physical threats to poll workers, actual people who are saying things like, we see information that goes out on social media saying, don't bother voting, you're going to face long lines, you're going to be thirsty, you're going to be hungry, you're going to get turned turned away. They're not going to accept your ID. There's all sorts of messaging out there to try to discourage people from going to polls. So what is Colorado doing, and what do you and your fellow secretaries of state from other states talk about to try to combat attacks on voting rights? I mean, from everything from physical threats to poll workers down the line.
Yeah, and I would just counter your question with, you didn't mention AI deepfakes, which is the new realm of potential voter suppression through massive disinformation. So there is a lot going on. I would say in Colorado, we are considered the nation's gold standard of elections. We have vote by mail for all, so we mail every registered active voter a mail ballot, period. On top of that, we have weeks of early voting, we have same-day voter registration. In my first year in office, I was able to lead the largest voter reform package in the country. So we increased access all across the state, 65% more drop boxes, more voting centers, guaranteed access on tribal lands, guaranteed access on college universities, parolee reenfranchisement, automatic voter registration, and that was just in 2019. So we have been pushing the envelope both for voter access, but also to try to safeguard from some of these attacks. Just this year, our legislative session ended in the beginning of May. I was happy to lead the first law making it a felony to be a fake elector or to conspire to be a fake elector in the entire country. We passed the first law in the country to guarantee voting centers in jails and detention centers. So when we're talking about folks having access regardless of the amount of money in their bank account or their zip code, well, a lot of people are in jails or detention centers because they can't afford the bond, their bail. That doesn't extinguish your constitutional right. But I also led a new law on deepfakes. So do you all know what deepfakes are? So it's new technology, AI technology, that is used to make someone look or say something that they're not doing. The first big prominent political deepfake we saw a couple months ago during the primaries, when Joe Biden's voice was deepfaked. And a robocall went out to a state and said, don't worry, don't vote, just hold tight, just wait until the general. Now, this is really troubling, because with deepfake technology, it's only going to get better. And suddenly we have to prepare Americans to not trust their eyes or their ears. So it's more than just saying, don't trust what your friend that you inherently trust says on Facebook, because that might be Russian propaganda to divide us. Now we have to tell people, don't trust your own eyes. Don't trust your own ears. So we're about to embark on a really new frontier of degrading American institutions. So, of course, some of this speech is protected under the First Amendment, as it should be. But states really need to quickly lean in and regulate deepfakes as much as they can. So I led a law that will require on deepfakes of candidates or elected officials, and we can only regulate state candidates and state elected officials, not federal, that if they're deepfake, there needs to be a disclaimer on the communication saying, basically to Coloradans, this is manipulated. And if there is not that disclaimer, there will be civil enforcement through my office. The person affected can file a lawsuit, they can bring the injunction, they could try to shut it all down, they can go after money damages. But it's just like a droplet of what we need to be doing as a nation to prepare. You know, thinking about robocalls, what if that Joe Biden robocall goes out on Election Day at 2 p.m.? How are we going to respond as a nation? So we are really thinking through a series of things. In 2020, I was leading planning in Colorado about federal law enforcement seizing voting equipment. Everybody thought it was far-fetched until it came out that that was actually on the table in the Trump administration. We plan for active shooters, for grid failures, for all of these disasters, for folks going and carrying guns outside of voting centers to try to scare people, which has happened in Colorado, and then I made it a crime to do that. But we see that all these new issues bubble up. And what I would say is there are great secretaries of state out there who are working really hard, But the big lie in the politics of election denialism has also touched secretaries of state, the chief election officers in the vast majority of states. So we need every good person, of Republican or Democrat, to do everything they can to prepare for this election cycle. And unfortunately, I don't think we can wait on Congress for help. But we do really need the DOJ to lean in where they can and prosecute these cases. If there are deep fakes that are calling for harm to election workers, that needs to be taken very seriously. But regardless of deep fakes, if there are issues threatening the integrity of our elections or our election judges or officials, we need to see prosecutors really lean in very quickly so folks know that they cannot get away with destabilizing our elections, committing crimes to try to tilt elections in their favor.
All right. Neil, tell us what voter suppression tactics you are watching and worried about for this forthcoming election cycle.
Okay, I'll do that quickly, but I did want to just say, because it's probably my last chance to say this, I've been on hundreds of panels in DC, and I've not been on a panel with 4 women before, and it's just so great.
Let's give ourselves a round. I feel like people should be taking pictures of this.
Yeah, I mean, you see the reverse all the time. I don't do those panels, but they're, and it's so remarkable. So, so in terms
we're glad to have you add some diversity to our panel.
Happy to do it for you. So in terms of the threats, I think they're the ones Jenna mentioned, basically, of, voter ID, ballot restrictions and those kinds of things. There's one other thing I just want to put on the table, and it's picked up on Jenna's point about how, imagine a 2 p.m. election day call that's a deep fake. The whole idea behind Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was we have to stop the stuff before it occurs. We need to have the prophylactic rules in advance. You can't sue after the fact because you can't undo an election. So it's great that you have a remedy for deep fakes, but if it's a 2 p.m. call, you can't enjoin the election. It's election day is going to happen, and you're not going to a court's not going to undo the result, whatever it is, afterwards. So that is a fundamental, I think, problem of the current structure. And it's going to get a little bit worse because the one tool we have left, or it might get worse, the one tool we have left in the Voting Rights Act is called Section 2. And that allows for people to sue and if there's a change to the voting rules that are racially regressive in some way. 4 years ago, a couple of justices on the Supreme Court said, hey, that section doesn't mean what everyone says it does, that private parties can sue. It only means the U.S. Justice Department can sue. And now there is a case that's accepted that theory in the Court of Appeals, and it is possibly going up to the Supreme Court. And if it goes to the Supreme Court, there is a real chance that that one remaining section of the Voting Rights Act is also going to be struck down, or not struck down, but neutered to have virtually no effect. So that's, I think, a clear and present danger.
Mary, Neil referenced the Supreme Court, and I think underlying all of this and unspoken in our conversation is what is the perception of the legitimacy and impartiality of our court system, our judicial system. I know that the ABA put out its own recommendations for ethical standards that you wanted the Supreme Court justices to impose on themselves. They actually impose something that's completely non-binding and doesn't actually have any enforcement mechanism. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts of what is the public's perception of what is supposed to be a beautiful part of our Constitution, the American judiciary?
Yeah, well, we're talking about equity today and democracy, and there's not just one pillar of democracy, there's several pillars, and we're talking about voting, we're talking about election systems, but the independence of our judiciary is a fundamental foundation of our democracy. And we need to uphold the independence of the judiciary. In fact, lawyers, I feel, have a special responsibility to do so because often judges cannot speak for themselves. We saw the incredible thing happen with Judge Walton went on CNN because I think he felt that people weren't sticking up for judges. We're seeing, just like you've gotten all those threats, judges are getting physical threats, their court administration staff is getting threats, and no one should be fear for their life simply for doing their job. But unfortunately, it's actually ironic because 50 years ago this year, the ethics code for all the lower federal courts except the Supreme Court was adopted in the wake of Watergate in 1974. And the Supreme Court did not have a code of ethics, let alone a binding code of ethics. And it is true that I think the public trust in the Supreme Court is probably at one of its lowest ebbs. And we need to respect the legitimacy of our judicial systems. And at the American Bar Association, we called for a binding code of ethics to be applicable to the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court did in response, they adopted a code, but it's not binding. So you see that the Supreme Court justices are the only court, the federal court, that can decide just on their own whether they want to recuse or not from a case.
Of
so
course,
we're seeing that right now.
critical with Justice Alito's flags that have flown over his homes, raising questions, and then him deciding he's not going to recuse himself from those cases. LaFleur, we're all sort of deep in politics here in Washington, and we sort of are thinking right in front of our noses about the immediate impact or the impact in November. Take us, close us out for this panel by going up to 30,000 feet and giving us a historical view. As an historian, you look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and what was seen as a transformative and sort of, I want to say, it was seen as fundamentally changing American democracy. Do you fear that now, 60 years later, we're actually backing away from that? Are we regressing in the voting rights we have?
Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but to some degree, I would say that's the case. So if we think about post-1965, within 3 years of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, you see the registered number of Black voters increase by upwards of 70%. Right? Now, taking us forward, I alluded to some of the laws that are now potentially rolling that back. And there's a bit of a, maybe seemingly a mismatch, right? You see Black voters have a crucial impact in swing states like Georgia in 2020. And you might think, well, everything's generally okay, right? Black people have been able to help elect Democratic presidents and to get both substantive and descriptive representation. But I don't think this really takes into account the sort of massive counter-mobilization efforts that have had to take place on the part of groups like Fair Fight or Black Voters Matter to actually counteract much of this these voter suppression efforts, right? That's not necessarily something that we can quantify, but we can at least think about the counterfactual had those groups not existed, right? Had they not been able to counter the purging of the voter rolls and things of that nature. And what's really, I think, problematic about that is that these groups are expending effort to combat the suppression where they could be actually mobilizing on other issues that are of importance to their constituencies, expending energy to get other legislation and other, there's an opportunity cost essentially, right? So they're now having to put efforts into just accessing what every American should be able to have without this massive counter-mobilization effort. And so in terms of being the bearer of bad news, I'd like to see, and I try not to speak too much from a normative perspective, but we'd want to see in a multiracial democracy people having access to the vote, access to the ballot without having to mount these hurdles. And unfortunately, that's not something that we're seeing.
That is a downcast note to end on, so I think I'm going to give the final word actually to Mary Smith, because you mentioned a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Some of you may not know that Mary is actually Native American, and it would be good to have a voice from you about how all of this is affecting Native American voting rights, and then maybe we can have a positive spin on what the ABA is trying to do to turn around what LaFleur said, giving us a sort of positive route forward.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking, because I know Native Americans, they get overlooked a lot. In fact, surprisingly, CNN, when they were reporting in 2020 the presidential election in Arizona, they listed, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and then they had other. And everybody in the Native community was outraged. But yeah, there's been a lot of efforts, things that you don't hear about, like for instance, some people who live on reservations, they don't actually have a street address. And so when you go to vote and they're asking for your address, that is, voter suppression. And then another thing, I know the pendulum's swinging a lot on whether you need ID to vote. And to the extent that that's been required in the past, a lot of Native Americans, they don't have state IDs, they have tribal IDs, and some states were not accepting tribal IDs to vote. But the American Bar Association, we have passed resolutions for voting rights for Native Americans, and I really appreciate the opportunity today, because that's really what it's all about, is equity in voting and everyone having the opportunity to exercise their rights as a citizen of the United States. So.
Well, thank you so much, and I want our audience to join me in affirming this is in fact the best panel of the day, right? Let's thank everyone up here. You're amazing. I learned so much, and I know everyone else did. Thank you. Thank you.